Let's start. So, in my previous lectures from reproductive physiology, I have discussed about the functional anatomy of male reproductive system and spermatogenesis process. After that, I have discussed about the role of different types of hormone in spermatogenesis process. So, in today's lectures, I will be discussing mainly the functional anatomy of female reproductive systems only. So, as we know that like male reproductive system, the female reproductive system is also very vital for reproductive point of view. So, to know about the details of reproductive process, the female reproductive systems are involved, we must know what are the different reproductive part or what are the different structural part of female reproductive systems and what are their functional features. And being a medical student, we must know the each and every different structural part of both male and female reproductive system, and we also must know about their functional characteristics. So here you can see the two most important parts that I am going to discuss. One is functional anatomy of female reproductive systems, and another one is a little about the ovarian follicle. If you see the structural part of the female reproductive system, it is mainly composed of different parts, 4 different parts. So what are these 4 different structural parts? And whether all those 4 different structural parts are equally important for reproductive point of view. Mainly, the female reproductive system is composed of external genitalia. And that external genitalia is also known as the vulva. And second most important part is internal genitalia. So here in the reproductive process, about the external genitalia and internal genitalia played an important role, and their roles is equal. So other than this, there are certain types of accessory glands and some associated endocrine organs also equally important. So now let me first discuss with the first part, that is the external genitalia, which is also known as the vulva. Here's the external genitalia is mainly composed of 5 different parts, and these are Mons Pubis, Labia Majora, Labia Minora, Clitoris, and Vestibule. Now we'll see about their structural locations and their functional characteristics only. Let's start with the first part, that is the Mons Pubis, which is a part of female external genitalia. You can see the most important characteristics of this Mons Pubis is it is a fatty pad, right? And that fatty pad is located anterior to the pubic bones. You can see from the diagrams, this is the Mons Pubis. And the most important type of tissue presence in this Mons Pubis is fat tissue or adipose tissue. And it is superior to the external genitalia, that is called as superior to the Labia Majora. Here's, if you see the exact locations of this structural part, it lies over the pubic bones and pubic symphysis. Here's another important characteristics of Mons Pubis is the developments of pubic hair, and that hairs basically develops after puberty, right? The developments of that pubic hair after puberty has some functional role. We'll see what is the functional role of that pubic hairs or the hairs that is grown in the Mons Pubis. So the functional point of view is it helps absorb shock, and it also involves the reductions the friction mainly during physical activities. It means it has some important functional role. Most important thing is the pubic hairs or Mons pubis are mainly involved to maintain the shock, or it helps to reduce the frictions during sexual intercourse. Next important function is, as a part of external genitalia, it contains some special gland called sebaceous gland. And that sebaceous gland is important because it secretes some fluid called sebum. And it also has some nerve endings. So both the sebaceous glands and nerve endings is equally important because they contribute in the sensory stimulations, right? And ultimately, they potentially playing roles in the sexual arousal, right? And after that, you can see the enlarges at puberty due to the estrogens. If you see the levels of estrogens after puberty, the level of estrogens is high, comparatively high. And that high level of estrogens actually involves with the depositions of that adipose tissue in the Mons pubis portions. And that accumulations of the adipose tissue, or due to the presence of the sebaceous glands in that particular structural positions, it helps to maintain the sexual arousals even immediate after the pubertal period. The next part you can see, this is also part of female external genitalia. So it is called Labia Majora. If you see the structural locations of Labia Majora, it is connected in both the anterior portions as well as posterior portions of vestibule. And this part is called the Labia Majora, right? And it is the thickening part which is starting with the anterior portions of clitoris, and it develops downward. What is the characteristic features of this Labia Majora? It is a paired structures that develops longitudinally, and it is a folds of skin that is located to the Labia Minora. Keep silence, please. So it extends downward as well as the backwards from the Mons pubis. So it is develops towards the downward as well as develops towards the backward, right? So we can see now the Labia Majora, mainly the outward portions, which is a thick skin fold or fold of skin. It also contains some sweat glands and some sebaceous glands. Both the sweat glands or presence of that sweat glands and sebaceous glands helps to reduce the dryness of that particular structures. So it contains some adipose tissue, smooth muscles and blood vessels along with some nerve endings. And if you compare these structures with the male external genitalia, it is very much similar to the male scrotum. So this is just a brief structural overview about the Labia Majora. What is the functional features of that structural part? Yes, it has some protective role. So what type of protective role? It encloses and shields the Labia Minora, clitoris and vaginal openings. It means this Labia Majora has some protective role. Mainly it protects some female internal genitalia part, as well as it also protects some others external genitalia part. It also shows some a barrier role. This barrier rules actually helps to prevent the developments of infection. So how? It helps prevent the entry of various types of pathogens into the vaginal canal. So that vaginal canals is very much sensitive to infectious agents, and there is a high chances of exposures of that infectious agents to the vaginal canal. To protect that vaginal canals, there must be specific structural parts. So here, Labia Majora involves with the protections of that vaginal canals. Mainly, it protects that parts from the infections of various types of pathogens. It also helps in the reductions of the friction, as well as it acts as a thermal insulators. So how? The fat contents or adipose tissue that is present into that thick skin fold helps maintain the temperatures of the internal genitalia. The secretions of sebums is very important. So here the sebaceous gland secretes the sebum. Sebaceous glands provides the lubrications and helps prevent the dryness. So it is very common that the dryness of that structural part. But to maintain that dryness or to prevent the dryness, the sebaceous glands helps by releasing some fluids called sebaceous fluid. Hair growth support. As I mentioned, the Mons Pubis is the most important site where pubic hairs are grown, and it has some protective role. Like that, here also, this structural part, Labia Majora, covered with some pubic hairs post-puberty, which reduces the frictions as well as it traps the debris. It also involves with the regulations of some hormonal release, and the release of that hormones somehow involves with some reproductive actions. Mainly here, hormonal responsiveness means it becomes more prominent at puberty, and it is due to the estrogen-driven fat depositions. So this is the thickest part of female reproductive system, and the thickness of that part is mainly due to the accumulations of adipose tissue or fat tissue. And post-puberty, what we see, there is a excessive formations of the hormone estrogen, and that estrogen hormones actually promotes the accumulations or depositions of the adipose tissue into that particular structural part. So these are some important functional characteristics of Labia Majora. Now, next part. This is also the part of external genitalia called Labia Minora, which is also known as inner lips. If you see the locations of that inner lips or a minora, it lies inside the Labia Majora. You can see this is the part, right? It is present in both the sides. Its presence on each side of the vaginal vestibule that extends from the clitoris anteriorly to the forceps posteriorly. It means it starts with this and extends towards the downward. And it encloses the openings of the urethra as well as the vagina. And if you see other characteristics of these inner lips, it is very thin and hairless. And it is composed of some highly vascularized connective tissue. The most important characteristics, the absence of here in that particular part, as well as the blood vessels, or this part is very rich in blood vessels. As well as it also contains some important glands called sebaceous glands. So now we can see this was the majora part, which is very thick. Just inside this majora part there is a thin layer which is called inner lips, and it is nothing, it is the Labia Minora. Now, what are the most important functional characteristics? It protects the vaginal and urethral openings. How? It shields the vestibules, urethral orifice, and vaginal openings from injury and infections. Yes, Like as I've already mentioned that vaginal canals is very important. It has several functional features. So it needs to protect that side. So here's the inner leaves shows that protective role. It not only protects structurally, but it also involves to prevent the infections, as well as it involves with the, it helps to protect that part from various types of mechanical injury. It secretes some mucus to keep the vulvar area moist and prevent dryness. So here's again, due to the presence of that particular glands, it secretes some fluids, and that fluid is important. It involves the guiding of urine flow. So how? It helps direct the flow of urines from the urethral opening. So the urethral opening is an important part of vestibule. Or what? It should be protected so that the structural part will be protected from various types of infections. So here's this labia minora not only protects that part, at the same time it helps direct the flow of urine from the urethral opening. It enhances the sexual arousal. How? Because this part is basically rich in blood vessels as well as nerve endings that contributes to sexual sensations and enjoys during arousal. And it is only due to the presence of rich blood vessels and due to the presence of some sensory nerve endings. It supports the clitoral hood formation. So here's the clitoral hood, actually like a cap that protects the clitoris. So here's it forms the hood over the clitoris and protecting it. It provides a various functions. It helps prevent the entry of different types of pathogens by sealing the vaginal openings and closed. Unlike the labia majora, they are hairless and it is very delicate structures, and it is suited for the protections of inner parts of the vagina. So these are some important functional features of this external genitalia part. Now comes to the next part called clitoris. So what is the exact locations of that clitoris and how it is important? It is situated at the top of the vulva. So this is the vulva region and this is the clitoris. So at the top of the vulva there is a clitoris. If you see the size of that clitoris, it is a very tiny shape or tiny size whose diameter is around 5 to 8 millimeter. And that clitoris is protected by a cap called clitoral hood, right? And that clitoris contains some special type of tissue called erectile tissue. And the presence of those erectile tissue in clitoris is very important in reproductive or sexual point of view. So it contains corpora cavernosa, which is an erectile tissue, and along with this, the clitoris, though it is a very tiny structures, but it contains numbers of nerve endings, mainly the sensory nerve endings. And this part involves the sensory functions in during arousal. So now we can say this is the most important structural part, which is a part of external genitalia. Now what are the functional features or important role? This is the primary organs for female sexual pleasure, and that part is rich in sensory nerve endings, and it is the most sensitive parts of the female genitalia. Along with this, during the arousal, these parts become engorged with the blast and it erects during sexual stimulations. And these erections of that sexual, clitoris is mainly due to the presence of some erectile tissue. Yes, though it is a part of a vaginal canals or part of vulva, it has no role in urination and even no role in reproduction. But it is solely involved in sexual function only. It triggers the orgasm. It directs the stimulation, direct stimulations can lead to the clitoral orgasm that involves the rhythmic contractions and pleasure. It supports the female sexual response cycle it plays key roles in libido, arousal, as well as in climax that enhances the sexual experience. And if you compare the clitoris parts with the male external genitalia, it is homologous to penis. And both the clitoris and penis is developed from the same embryonic tissue. And both of these contain some erectile tissue. And both the clitoris and penis are rich in vascular tissue. It has some protective role, like the clitoral head shields it from the frictions and from the irritations when not aroused. So these are some important functional features that is related to this structure. Now comes to the next part, vestibule of vulva. Again, this is an important part of external genitalia. And if you see the structures, it is basically divided into two parts. One is anterior section and another is the posterior section. Anterior vestibule and posterior vestibule. Here, the vestibule is the cleft-like space or the regions of the vulva that is located between the labia minora. So this part was the labia minora. So in between labia minora, there is a vestibule. Right? And this vestibule is important because it contains some openings. So what are the openings? The openings are urethra and the vagina. You can see from the structures, this is the vestibular regions, a vestibule. In this vestibule, there is a urethral opening just beneath the clitoris. And if you go downwards, there is another part called vaginal opening, right? So the vestibule part is important because it contains two most important openings. One is urethral opening and another one is the vaginal opening. Other than this vestibule also contains some special type of gland called Bartholin gland. You can see from these structures about the locations of that Bartholin gland, which is also a T-shaped structures, Bartholin gland. Now we'll see what is the functional features of all those Bartholin glands, urethra, vaginal canal or other structural part. See, it receives openings of key structure. Mainly, it contains the openings of the urethra, vagina, Bartholin glands and skin glands. It acts as a passage for urine and menstrual flow. Here, it allows urines to exit via the urethra as it contains the urethral opening, and it also involves the release of menstrual blood through the vaginal opening. It facilitates the intercourse as well as it also involves the childbirth. The vaginal orifice within the vestibules act as the entry points of the penis, and it also acts as the exit site for the baby during delivery. What are the other important functions? Lubrications during arousal. How? Because as we have seen, this part contains some special type of gland called Bartholin gland. And that Bartholin gland is actually important because it releases some fluid that helps in the lubrications. So secretions from that Bartholin glands and spleen glands moistens the vestibule that enhance the comfort during sexual intercourse. It also involves some sensory functions because this part is rich in nerve endings, sensory nerve endings that contributes to sexual sensation. And this part also acts as a common chamber. So common chambers for what? Because it is anatomically serves as the shared space for both the reproductive as well as the urinary tract at the external level. So it means this vestibule acts as a common chamber because this part involves the two different functions. Now this was the brief discussions about the different structural part of external genitalia of female and their functional characteristics. Now let's start with the next part, that is called internal genitalia part. Like external genitalia, the internal genitalia also composed of some structural part. So what are these? These are vagina, uterus, fallopian tube, ovaries and cervix. Functionally all those structural parts are equally important. Now we will see about their locations and their functional characteristics. So this is the general structural overview. See here. Let's start with the first part called vagina. Here, see the structures. This area is called vaginal area, and this vaginal area is basically a tube-like structures. And these tube-like structures is mainly made up of some muscle or muscle fiber, right? And it's if you see the length of that tube is around 8 to 10 centimeter. And this vagina from outside to inside is connected with the cervix, right? It connects the cervix to the vestibule. And what are the most important functional features? It receives the penis during sexual intercourse. It acts as a passageway for menstrual flow, as well as it also involves or acts as a birth canal during delivery. And if you see some chemical features of this vaginal canal, the chemical features is very much acidic. But why? Because if you see the chemical characteristics of this, the lactobacilli in the vaginal canal converts glycogens to lactic acids that maintains the acidity, and that acidic pH in the vaginal canals is very important because it prevents the growth of harmful bacteria as well as fungi. So not only it prevents the development of the fungus, it also, this acidic pH is also helpful for the development of some beneficial vaginal flora. It acts as a natural defense against infections. So now it is clear that this is the first structural part of internal genitalia of female. See here, the second one is called uterus. So you can see from the structures, this is the uterine region. This is the uterine region, and this uterine region is mainly composed of 4 different structural parts. You can see from here, what are these? These are called fundus. This is the top parts, right? It is dome-shaped structures, and it is the upper portions of the uterine region. Next is the main body part. Next is isthmus. Isthmus is basically a narrow part of the uterus. This portion is called isthmus. And the last part is called the cervix, which is neck-like structures, that is the opening portions into the vagina. So here, if you see the histological features of this uterus, it is divided into 3 different regions. From outside to inside, it is called peritoneum and perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. So the very outermost layers is called the perimetrium, the middle layer, which is the thickest layer, called myometrium, and the innermost layers is called the endometrium. So from outside to inside, it is made up of 3 different tissue layer. These are perimetrium, myometrium, and endometrium. Like other structural part, these parts also important because it acts as a site of implantations of fertilized egg, as well as it also acts as a site for placentation. So it means this endometrium wall acts as a site for implantation after fertilization. It supports the fetal development. Not only this, due to the presence of numbers of muscles, the contractions of that muscles helps to expel the fetus during labor. So here's numbers of cells presence. That cells undergo some cyclic changes during the menstrual cycle. So here you can see it undergoes cyclic changes in response to certain hormones, like in presence of hormone estrogen and progesterone. So this is the structural overview of the uterine structures. Now if you see the other parts, the next part is called the fallopian tube. This one, fallopian tube. This one. You also can see from here, this is the fallopian tube. So what is the features of that fallopian tube? It is around 10 to 12 centimeter long, which is bilaterally extended from the uterus to the ovaries. So this is the uterine region, and this fallopian tube extended towards the ovaries in both sides, right? If you see the different structural part of that fallopian tube, it is mainly composed of 4 different structural parts. That is starting from that portions. So what are these? Or you can see from here, the hair-like projections of the fallopian tube is called fimbria, and it is a finger-like projection. The next part is immediate after that fimbria. This is infundibulum and ampullary region, and finally isthmus. And that fallopian tube is very important. Now see, what is the most important functional role of that fallopian tube? It captures the ovum. So the capturing ovums is very important for fertilization. Fimbria sweeps over the ovary to collect the released ovum. You can see this one. So this ovary releases the ova, which is received by that fimbria, and after that it transports the gametes like cilia and smooth muscle contractions moves the ovums and sperms towards the mid portions of the fallopian tube, where actually fertilization takes place. So what is the fertilization site or site of fertilizations? It is usually the ampullar regions. This is the regions where fertilization takes place, right? And after the fertilizations, and the most important things here is, here's this release of that mature ovum is basically occurs during the 14th day of a menstrual cycle. And it supports the formations of zygote, right? And that zygote remains in that particular fallopian tube for a certain period of time. So early embryo remains here for 3 to 4 days before reaching to the uterine wall. And another important functions of this structural part is the presence of some special type of cells like called epithelial cells or PEG cells. That PEG cells provide the nourishments to sperms and to early embryo, and it helps to develop the early embryo. So these are some functional characteristics of the fallopian tube. Now comes to the next part. Next part is ovaries. You can see, as I've already mentioned, that fallopian tubes is connected into structures from both the sides, and this is the ovaries, where the maturations of the ovum takes place. So here it is a paired structures, and it is located in the pelvic cavity, one on each side of the uterus. So this is one, this is another one. So in both the side of the uterus there is a ovary. So it is attached by certain types of ligaments. You can see this is the ligaments, this is the ligaments, and that ligaments helps the attachments of that ovary to the uterus. So it is covered by certain types of epithelial tissue, mainly the germinal epithelial tissue. It contains some follicles, and that follicles are of a different types, and the types depends on the growth of menstrual cycle. Now see what are the most important functional features of that part. It involves the gametogenesis, mainly involved with the formations of the egg cells or ovum. That is very essential for the process of, it is basically processed by the process of oogenesis. And here another important thing is the ovulations, and during the ovulatory periods there is a release of mature ovums, mainly during the 14th day of menstrual cycle. And these parts involves some endocrine function, because these parts secrete some endocrine hormone. So what are the most important types of endocrine hormones are secreted? Here these are estrogen, progesterone, inhibin and relaxin, and all those hormones are functionally different. The estrogen hormone stimulates the developments of female secondary sexual characteristics. Progesterone prepares the endometrium for implantations, which is very essential during the developments of a baby, embryo. And inhibin hormones inhibits the FSH hormones, as well as relaxin is very important in a particular period of times or particular period of pregnancy. It releases uterine muscles and pubic symphysis in pregnancy. That ultimately helps the release of the baby through the vaginal canal during parturition. So other than this, I've already mentioned about some accessory glands, that is also important, about the vestibular glands, about the skin glands. Now in the ovaries, there are certain types of follicles called ovarian follicles, and that ovarian follicles is important because that ovarian follicles of ovary, they releases certain types of hormones. So what is the role of that ovarian follicles? You can see this is an ovarian follicle, right? In these ovarian follicles there is a tiny structures called primary oocyte, right? So here's an ovarian follicle is a spherical structures in the ovarian cortex that contains an immature oocyte or immature egg cell. This is the immature egg cell that is surrounded by supporting follicular cell. You can see this is the supporting follicular cell, right? That undergoes some structural changes that leads to the developments of a mature Graafian follicles inside the ovary. So here each follicle contains some egg cells, that is immature egg cells, and these follicles is surrounded by special cell types called granulosa cell, and that granulosa cells is important because it produces an endocrine hormone, that is estrogen. Other than this, you can see from the structures, the outer layers of these structures is called theca cells, and which is outer layers that aids in the hormone productions, along with zona pellucidum. It produces certain types of proteins, mainly the glycoproteins, that is essential for the development of oocyte. And you can see the structures of antrum here during the developmental phase or during the developments of that immature oocytes. We can see the structural changes here. Here antrum is a fluid-filled cavity that is found in the later stage of the oocyte maturation, and after the maturations of that oocyte or egg cell, it is released into the fallopian tube, which is act as a site for fertilizations. So this is a very brief structural and functional characteristics of female external genitalia. I hope now each and every structure, about each and every structural part, their locations and their functional characteristics is now clear. Thank you.